Compared to other MMOs with a similar combat style to Final Fantasy XIV, this game has some of the weirdest oddities among them, and I'm not talking about classics like the burst meta and all that. No, I'm thinking of things like the 3-second tick timer, cast attacks, probably not the one you're thinking of, and how potencies compare across jobs. In this video, I have collected 10 weird mechanics of Final Fantasy XIV that you might find funny or fascinating to know. And if you know a weird mechanic to share of your own, please do leave a comment about it. Now then, let's get started. Number 1. Cast attacks. So most advanced players know that using any action incurs some sort of animation lock. Usually, this is 0.5 seconds plus twice your latency. Why twice? Because you both need to send your action to the server and then receive back the confirmation, for some reason. Now, with actions with cast times, there's this time frame where you can slide cast, meaning continue casting while moving. I go over that in this separate video. During this slide casting window is where the animation lock would normally be. However, this animation lock where you can't do anything else is actually slightly longer. Around 1/10 of a second plus up to around 2 frames of time after the cast has actually finished. This means that when you cast an action with a cast time, you're actually locked into doing that for its full cast time, plus around 0.1 seconds added flat on top. For nearly all jobs, this is largely inconsequential. All the healers use less than 2.5 seconds on their casts, Paladin uses either instant or 1.5 second cast times, and Samurai and Reaper use 1.3 seconds. And while Summoner's Ruby Rite takes 2.8 seconds to cast, its GCD is 3 seconds, making it have no cast attacks issues either. However, Black Mage has mainly 2.5 second cast time spells, or longer. This means that even a spell like Blizzard 1 actually has an effective base cast time of 2.6 seconds rather than 2.5 seconds. You can even observe this 0.1 second as, if it wasn't there would not be time for the cast bar to disappear at all. It would just start over the cast immediately. While that might seem quite insignificant, it's just 1/10 of a second after all, but over the course of a fight, this can add up. And when comparing actions between each other, it also matters. For example, a Thundercloud Thunder 3 has a base GCD of 2.5, but a regular Thunder 3 technically has an effective cast time of 2.6 seconds. Fire Force cast time becomes 2.9 seconds instead of 2.8, and so on and so forth. Now, there are 2 specific cases where this really matters. The first one is that making a spell that has a cast time that is equal to the GCD instant not only skips the cast time, but actually saves you 0.1 seconds, which is a bit like making the attack do about 4% or so more damage. That is with a base GCD of 2.5 seconds, of course. This is also another reason why triple cast on top of ley lines is so helpful, because it both reduces the cast time to the GCD, but in the same fell swoop removes the cast attacks. The other case is in relation to the helpfulness of spell speed. If you have, say, 500 spell speed from gear on a Black Mage, and that changes the cast time on Fire 4 from 2.8 seconds to 2.7, around 3.6% time saved. However, in reality, you're actually reducing it from 2.9 to 2.8, closer to 3.4%. This is somewhat important because speed's value is that it reduces your GCD linearly by a percentage. But if you're about to always have like an extra 0.1 added on top of every cast, that makes speed at least a bit less helpful. That is not to say that speed isn't nice on a Black Mage, but it certainly plays in favor of the slower Black Mage builds in a way too. Number 2. The Players Hurtbox. As you may know, for an area of effect attack of yours to connect with an enemy, the area of the spell just needs to reach the targeting reticle of the enemy. Meaning enemies with really massive targeting reticles, a common illness amongst bosses these days, are more likely to get touched by that flare cast or limit break or what have you. However, that would make you think that your Hurtbox would also equate to your targeting reticle, right? Wrong. The Player's Hurtbox is actually just the exact coordinates you happen to stand on. A single pixel in size, effectively. This leads to hilarious situations like an attack that covers everything on the field, except the very single pixel at the edge, and you can hide in that specific spot. Exactly as demonstrated right here. Now, isn't that something? Number 3. Continuing in the same lane, compared to other MMOs, or even games in general, Final Fantasy XIV has a quite surprising way of deciding whether you get hit by mechanics or not. Rather than the attack connecting if the spell visibly hits you, there is a specific snapshot moment where the game decides if you got hit. In most situations, this snapshot happens when the telegraph disappears, even if the actual attack lands like 5 seconds later. Sometimes, the exact moment that the snapshot happens can be a fraction of a moment before or after the telegraph disappears. Often, if the attack has a cast time, the snapshot also aligns with when the enemy finishes their cast. This of course can lead to a lot of confusion if the telegraph has no cast time, or worse, there is no telegraph at all. That is a lot more common in extreme or savage content, but it isn't uncommon to see in casual content. Essentially, the takeaway is that you need to make sure you are out of the telegraph before it disappears to be sure you don't get hit. Number 4. The backwards cast. Combining the subjects of the previous mechanics, we have the backwards cast. A very niche trick and oddity, but can be helpful in the right situation. Most actions with a cast time require you to look at the target while you're casting. This can sometimes be a problem if a gaze or glare mechanic is incoming. But what if I told you, you can do both? While most reliable if you're standing inside the targeting reticle, you just have to stand somewhat close to it and you can safely perform your full cast while looking away from your target. This can be helpful, as an example, in the Fell Court of Troya, or in any other fight with a glare mechanic really, as long as you can get close enough. Number 5. The combo timer. Now, in a game with a combo sequence, or even a combo timer, you'd assume that you have to perform the actions in order with no deviation, or at the very least within a reasonable time frame of each other. Over the years, the strictness of this feature has been slackened in Final Fantasy XIV. In fact, for the most part, unless a weapon skill or spell flat out begins a new combo or is otherwise considered the filler combo, almost nothing can break a combo these days. Actually, even some combos can be started without breaking an existing combo. On top of this, the combo timer is 30 seconds long, meaning that as long as you return to and continue the combo at least once every 30 seconds, you can keep it going. For a particularly hilariously long example, a Dragoon could perform a 5-step combo over the course of 2 minutes if they so desired. There isn't really a reason to, but you could. The main jobs where this combo timer comes up at all are Paladin, Gunbreaker, Reaper, and maybe a bit for Ninja as well. Number 6. The 3-second server tick. In most games, if you were to apply a damage over time effect that you know hits every 3 seconds and lasts 30 seconds, you'd assume it hits the first time, well, after 3 seconds, right? And the last hit happens exactly after 30 seconds when it ends, right? Well, in Final Fantasy XIV, most damage and healing over time effects tick together as one on a shared server tick. This means that the dot you applied for 30 seconds might tick for the first time 1.5 seconds into its duration, and the last time 28.5 seconds in. It will have 10 ticks of course, but exactly when they occur is a little bit fuzzy. The most fascinating result of such a feature is that, hypothetically, if your dot had its last tick on the 29th second and you reapplied it exactly on the 30th second, you could expect the first tick to happen 2 seconds in. However, this would also mean that, technically, you could wait with reapplying the dot for 1 second with no loss. While interesting to think about, it isn't really realistic to plan or optimize around, but it is an interesting result of the 3-second server ticks. To add to this, if you were to apply 2 different dots to an enemy at the same time, or 2 hots to a friend at the same time, the damage or healing these actions will do get combined into a single number as they tick together anyway. Number 7. Potencies don't always compare well. Potencies in Final Fantasy XIV are incredibly helpful to compare the power between actions on a specific job. However, sometimes it can be easy to forget that each job has their own passive modifiers, and sometimes some of the modifiers might not even be visible. A particularly good example of this is the fact that most pets scale differently than players. For example, with Living Shadow that ignores the stats your specific race has and simply is a Midlander Hyur every time. If you have two different jobs where you have exactly the same stats comparatively, and I mean exactly the same, you can sometimes compare their potencies directly. For example, Dancer, Bard and Machinist have the exact same base stats and similar passive damage bonuses by default, so assuming you're wearing the same equipment and equally good weapons, 100 Bard potency is equal to 100 Dancer potency is equal to 100 Machinist potency. This is because they all have exactly the same stats that matter, and they have exactly the same passive damage bonuses between each other in terms of traits. An example of how this can break apart once we aren't comparing mostly equal jobs is that all tanks get a special trait that allegedly gives them a bonus to damage dealt based on strengths. I mean, don't all strength jobs do that? Do you need a trait for that? Anyway, this can make the exact scaling of a tank a lot more unpredictable compared to a DPS job. Let's take an example. Here I use Double Down on Gunbreaker, and here I use Tenkagoken on Samurai. Notably, my Gunbreaker gear is slightly better than my Samurai gear, but that only serves to underline my point further. Double Down has 300% more potency than Tenkagoken, so if tanks and melee DPS scaled equally well, we should expect the better geared Gunbreaker to do more than 300% more damage with Double Down, right? Well, in this case, it is doing closer to 240% more. It is such a massive difference that it simply cannot be because of damage variance or some detail with the gear. It is simply because 100 Gunbreaker potency is not the same as 100 Samurai potency. This can also be emphasized by the fact that Samurai's Hakase does a good 25% more damage than Keen Edge while wearing just a weapon. In summary, potencies are for comparing a job's actions with itself and not necessarily for comparing between jobs. Number 8. Determination is weird. Determination claims to only boost the healing of healing spells, but what exactly qualifies as a healing spell? Does it need to be a spell? Well, it turns out the answer to that is no. It turns out that the tooltip stating that it increases the HP restored by healing spells, yes, specifically spells, is false. Here's a demonstration. Here, I have White Mage with two different gear sets, one with around 1000 determination and one with around 2000 determination. The weapon is the same and the amount of mind is the same, so as long as the heal is not a critical hit, the only stat difference is the determination itself. For the demonstration, I will use Medica 1, which heals for 400 cure potency and is decidedly a healing spell. And Assize, which also heals for 400 cure potency, but is not a spell and could possibly not be classified as a healing action given that it also does damage, assuming this is a specific type of classification in the first place, of course. With 1000 determination, Medica and Assize heals for around 10,400 per target. With 2000 determination, they both are closer to 10,800. While that isn't a huge difference, the problem is that if determination only affects healing spells, then Assize should not be affected by this gear change at all. For another example, let's look at Paladin. I have enough determination to increase my damage and healing by around 10%. So if abilities are not affected, then Holy Spirit and Holy Circle should heal for 10% more than Divine Veil. This is not the case, and they actually heal for the same amount. Now, maybe that's because Holy Spirit and Circle aren't considered healing spells. In that case, Clemency should heal for significantly more than 2.5 times the healing they do, as Clemency would be affected by determination, and they wouldn't, right? Yet, it does not. It heals for precisely 2.5 times as much. It appears that determination affects all healing done, rather than just spells, despite the tooltip stating otherwise. Number 9. Macro Spellqueueing. If you're coming from different MMOs that use macros, for example mouse over macros for healing, you might notice that it feels like the macros in Final Fantasy XIV are weirdly unresponsive. That is intentional. In Final Fantasy XIV, there is a mechanic called Spellqueueing, which makes it so that if you press a button over half a second in advance, the game will still recognize your button press and do it at the earliest possible time. Macros do not benefit from this, as they play one line of the macro per frame of gameplay on your screen. This means that if you had a macro that just as a single line said cast Cure 2, then it would only attempt to cast Cure 2 on the following frame after you press it. If you instead made a macro that used the majority of the macro space to repeatedly attempt to cast Cure 2, you would at least get like 13 frames where you attempt to cast it. But even if you played the game on 30 frames per second, that would still be less spell queuing than the game has by default. This in particular is the reason why mouse over macros aren't super widely used in Final Fantasy XIV, as it has a direct impact on the responsiveness of your buttons. And you don't really want your benediction button to just fail because you pressed it a moment too soon. Number 10. Buff Application Order. You may have noticed, if you use an action that applies to multiple targets, whether it is an AoE attack or a raid-wide buff, that the effect seems to apply one at a time. At least, this seems to happen most of the time. This can lead to interesting situations such as warriors bloodwetting, allowing the warrior to fully heal, get hit, fully heal again, get hit again, and fully heal again with a single swing of their own. I'm not entirely sure why the game does it like that, maybe an aesthetic detail? However, there are two exceptions to this rule that things are applied sequentially like this. The first exception is that shields apply almost instantaneously across all targets. In fact, Shake It Off and Divine Veil apply so quickly on other targets that it is possible to sometimes block a raid-wide attack for the rest of the party with such a shield without spending the shield for yourself. This insane application speed makes it possible to intercept attacks with barriers with much slimmer time margins than normal, and I do believe this change was made during Endwalker. The other exception is a way to force your attacks to connect faster. For example, if I use Warrior's Decimate normally here, you can see that the damage is dealt to each enemy one at a time. You can also see that the bloodwetting healing is applied one at a time. However, if I weave an action immediately after Decimate, the damage from Decimate is applied instantly and the healing from bloodwetting also applies instantly. For the most part, this isn't particularly significant, since both the damage and healing should apply just fine, just the same whether you get it half a second sooner or not. The one time where this might actually matter is with a buff that actually cares about when your attack connects, like for Nascent Flash. Forcing the damage to land slightly faster might sometimes lead you to sneak in more healing for your target ally than you normally would. Anyway, this is more like a weird game interaction than something important to play around, and really is highlighted on attacks that apply their damage really late in the animation. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can make sure to let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, back in Stormblood, and perhaps even in Shadowbringers, actions like White Mage's Plenary Indulgence took so long to get applied to the entire party that you had to wait a GZD with casting your Medica if you wanted to be sure Plenary Indulgence affected everyone in time. Fortunately, the delay has been greatly reduced nowadays, but it is still visible that effects like these are applied gradually.